Welcome to the Coach Barnabas podcast. It's time to take a few minutes and leave behind the stuff that drains us and recharge our batteries with some encouragement and insight. Finding the extraordinary in the ordinary.
Hi, welcome back to episode 38 of Coach Barnabas podcast. My name is Corey, and I say welcome back. Maybe I shouldn't assume that you've ever watched any of these episodes before. If so, welcome for the first time. Great to have you. I'm going to jump in here. This is I'm going to tell a little bit of my story here. If you've been following along for any length of time, especially maybe in the early episodes, I told a little bit of my backstory as I'm now living in the Northeast in Rhode Island. I'm originally from Northern California, hence the hoodie that I'm wearing. If you're watching on the YouTube and not on an audio only format, which is possible, and I appreciate you if you are. But I am, you'll see things around here that would indicate I am a Northern Californian native. That's where I'm from. I did move to Rhode Island in March of 2014, as we're now approaching the end of 2024. So I've been here going on 11 years now. So interesting backstory. It all revolves around a girl. I met my wife online. And so long story short, I moved here from California and we're living happily ever after. Whole lot of stuff in between there, which you can go back and listen to some. I'll probably share some more details as we go along. So I invite you to stick with me and, we'll kind of explore those things together. But today I want to focus on one particular element of that move, of that epic move from California. But before I do that, I want to back up and talk about another move that I made while I was living in California. I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area, living in a town, and I had an opportunity open up, a couple different opportunities open up for me in San Jose, California. I think it's the 10th largest city in the United States. It's a beautiful city. I loved living there. I was there for about 10, 12 years and loved my time there, loved the friendships I had. I was part of a great church there. Just a wonderful chapter in my life. But before I got there, I was living in a smaller town for a couple of years, active in ministry there. It was great. It was a great 2 years, but then God moved me on. And as I did, I consider when you make a move from one community to another, one town to another, one state to another, there's kind of a tripod of priorities. In no particular order, the tripod is basically this: find yourself a church, find yourself a job, and find yourself a place to live. Those three things are kind of key. So based on that philosophy that I have, the first thing I had was a church. That was kind of the impetus behind the move. I was invited to participate and get involved in ministry at what I consider a rather prestigious church in the community. And so that was kind of the driving force behind my move from one community to this one. The second leg of the tripod was I found myself a job. So going to church on Sundays, not a big deal. Then I got a job that was Monday through Friday. The town I was moving from was about 70 miles away. And if you have any familiarity with the San Francisco Bay Area traffic and highway system, you know that 70 miles, if you do it at 3 o'clock in the morning, you do that in about an hour. Any other time of day, it could take up to 3 hours to drive that same route. So what happened was that somebody I'd gotten to know through the church I was attending in San Jose offered me generously a mother-in-law unit he had in the backyard, and said, "Yeah, it's empty, and it's there for you if you need a place to stay for a little while you're trying to find," to me, the third leg of the tripod, a place to live. So it was very generous, and I took him up for a little while, and it was very kind, but I didn't want to overstay my welcome, and I had another situation up before I found my the place I ended up living for about 8 or 9 years. But before that, I stayed in this gentleman's mother-in-law unit. It's a great family. It's just great folks. I was very happy that they offered that. I didn't want to inconvenience them, but they convinced me that they would really like it if I stayed. So under all that, that's what I did. And so let's now fast forward to another time in my life where I had to kind of lean on somebody's similar generosity like that. So now is when I'm moving cross country. I am moving from California to Rhode Island. The first month or so of my arrival in Rhode Island, I had secured housing for about a month. And then I was going to have to find either my permanent place to live or, another temporary situation until I found the more permanent place to live. So unfortunately, I wasn't able to find anything within the first 30 days. So I was kind of scrambling. And the man who's a pastor, he was a founding pastor of the church I was attending then and still attending to this day, though he's no longer the pastor. He approached me and said, "Hey, look, as it turns out, I have a son, one of my sons, recently moved to San Francisco." Now, you might be thinking, whoa, mind blown. I haven't gotten there yet. But yeah, I was moving from the San Francisco Bay Area. His son recently moved to the San Francisco Bay Area and you have to understand this too. The area in which I live is tiny, okay? Rhode Island, you probably couldn't find on a map if because it's really not on the map because it's so small that there's usually, when you look at a map or a globe or something like that, you can't fit the word Rhode Island in any representation of a map of the United States. It's usually the letters RI somewhere out in the Atlantic with an arrow pointing to this itty bitty little dot that would represent Rhode Island. That's usually how it's presented. So it's a very tiny state. And again, I remind you, San Jose was like the 10th largest state in America. And I was moving to an area that wasn't even the 10th largest city in this little teeny tiny state. So very small and rural community. But nonetheless, here I am. And, it's a great little place to live, but, I was learning my way and everything. And so the pastor of the church said, "We have an empty room. You're welcome to it until you find yourself a place to stay." Again, very generous, and I was hesitant, but I also didn't have a lot of options. So very humbly, I accepted and had a wonderful time. It's a great family, and I was very, very blessed and fortunate to spend that time with them. And I was going through a lot of stuff. So having, in the home I was staying, somebody I could talk to about the struggles I was going through, the fears I had, the transition from one edge of the country to the opposite edge of the country. There's a lot of things, even culturally, you wouldn't think like, oh, well, you're still in the United States, but there's such a cultural difference between California and Rhode Island and the Northeast. And he really kind of talked me through it. Though he wasn't a New England native, he lived here for decades. And so he was well acclimated and gave me some real wisdom and insight into adjusting to the way of life here. So it was great. Now, fast forward a little bit. I've been there a couple of months, and I'm scrolling through social media on a Saturday, and I notice a buddy of mine, the same guy in San Jose who offered me the mother-in-law unit. He is in Boston, which is about an hour or so from here, and he's with his family. And he's in Boston. I'm like, so I reach out to him. It's like, "What are you doing? You're here in Boston. You're like an hour from me. It'd be great if we get together sometime." He goes, "Well, we're just spending some time here, and then we're attending a family reunion, and then we're heading back home." It's like, okay, well, maybe we can connect at some point. So yeah, well, if we have some downtime, that'd be awesome. It'd be great to see you. So, we kind of finish a conversation, but it's, again, how if you're familiar with social media, the conversation isn't that back and forth. It could be a couple hours between sentences because that's the nature of the thing. So at some point, I go back and I look at his page, his profile, and you can see who they're friends with. You can also see who your common friends are. And, he and I have tons of common friends because we attended the same church for over a decade. So we have hundreds of common friends. But I notice that on the little page, it shows you maybe, a handful, half a dozen or so common friends happens to be the people I'm staying with in Rhode Island. And wait a second. So I reach out to him and say, hey, I just happen to notice, how the heck do you know the people, I know these people too now that I'm in Rhode Island. So he gets back to me. He says, well, I told you about the family reunion, right? So yeah. He says, well, yeah, that's my cousin. So my friend in California, his mother, and my friend in Rhode Island who offered me a room in his house, his mother were sisters. Yeah. So it blew my mind. I was just like blown away by that. I mean, what are the odds that somebody from this huge city in California and a guy 3,000 miles away in a town you couldn't find if you were trying, okay, in a little tiny rural, to find his house. I mean, to this day, it's been years since I've been there because they've since moved to Georgia. So it's been some time since I've even been in their house. I couldn't even find it today. And I've lived here for almost 11 years. And I don't think I could find it today, but I was getting used to it. But it's hard to find. They live out in the woods. But these guys were first cousins. Their moms were sisters. Now, if you're one of those who think coincidences are a thing, let me just tell you, no. I don't believe in coincidences whatsoever. And this was by no means a coincidence. This was God, completely 100%. Because I'll tell you, at the time that I was going through this, I had more questions than answers. I had more uncertainties than anything else. I'd moved out here to pursue a relationship with somebody that could only succeed or fail based on our spending time together. And I'm living 3,000 miles away and doing the Hallmark thing of just flying in every month or two and spending a handful of days together is not reality. Okay. You can't really determine compatibility, how you're going to do in life together by going about it that way. We had to spend time together. We had to date. We had to just get used to each other and see each other and all that, experience life together. So I moved out here and she was agreeable to that. But then once I was here, it was very real and we're seeing each other a lot and she had to work through some things. And so there was a period of time when there were never any promises when I moved out here that we were going to live happily ever after. That was never a promise, never a guarantee. It was all question marks, just like any relationship is in those early stages. You don't know. Even if you have all the ooey gooey feelings and all the stuff, you still don't know. And how many marriages end up in divorce, even when they've been dating for a long time, they grew up together, whatever else. And here's two, adults in their 30s and 40s who meet online and all this stuff, right? So my point is that there were no guarantees, and here I am. I've committed to moving 3,000 miles away on the chance it might lead to marriage. And so I had a lot of questions, and it's like, here I am. But all that to say this, that once I had that moment where it's like my friend from years ago who offered me the exact same hospitality that the guy who turns out a dozen or so years later, who offered me the exact same hospitality, the fact that they were first cousins, whose moms were sisters, was a complete bookend to this kind of odyssey I was in. And it was God's way of saying, I am with you. This miracle that you are experiencing right now, I've been working on for decades. And not that he brought the family, from who I was staying with in Rhode Island, not that he brought them out here for that purpose, but that was all part of the plan. They were from the Northwest. They were from like Washington State. So West Coast to be sure, but still not even close to where I was living in Northern California. But here, decades earlier, they made the move to New England, and their family's here, and they've been established in this area, like I said, for decades, for generations, as they had two generations since, right? They had kids and then grandkids living in the area. So this was not something that was some fly-by-night thing that happened on the spur of the moment. That miracle that I experienced, the more detailed workings had begun decades earlier. And all this was to say, God did all this. He knew the end from the beginning. He's not limited by time like you and I are. We can only live in the moment. We can make some future plans, but this was where God's like, I knew this was going to happen. I've got it all prepared. I am going to show you that I'm paving the way for you to be here. Now, that doesn't mean things are going to end up the way you want them to be, but you're going to be where I want you to be. And I'm going to be with you in the place I want you to be. And so it reminded me of these two verses in Deuteronomy chapter 31. I want to read them to you. Okay. I'll repeat them a few times. This is what the Lord said. This was Moses, after God had spent time with Moses. You may, if you're familiar with the Old Testament, maybe you've watched the movie The Ten Commandments. But Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt, out of bondage, out of slavery. They wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and they were headed towards what would be known as the Promised Land. And God had told Moses that you will not experience a Promised Land. You will pass away before that time, and I will raise up Joshua. He will be the one who will then take the final step and lead the Israelites into the Promised Land. So when God has this conversation with Moses, Moses then delivers that message to Joshua. And these were the words that Moses spoke to Joshua, having been told this by God himself. Deuteronomy 31, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Okay, so I put it in the context of how it is in the Bible, but then think back to the context of where I was in my life. I've moved 3,000 miles. I'm kind of not necessarily wandering in the wilderness, but it's wilderness to me. I am unfamiliar with everything. I'm unfamiliar with everybody. I don't know my way to the grocery store without using my GPS. So, everything is new to me, and I have no promises, no assurances of what the future holds. None. Zero. And yet, God was saying to me these words. I'll read them again. The Lord himself goes before you, and he will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. So, again, thinking back to, there were times when I was discouraged. I was a bit scared. What have I done? Did I overstep things? Did I get out ahead of myself? Did I make a big mistake? Because going back would be very, very difficult. I had no promises. But then, in that moment where I realized God is in the middle of all this by just showing me his signature on the whole thing, that these two people who opened up their homes to me as a lifeboat, really, 12, 15 years apart from each other, are that closely related, but all of this was unbeknownst to them. They didn't talk about it and somehow devise this plan that would one day be revealed to me. They didn't know until I told them, you're not going to believe this. So I told them the story and everything. And again, all this is just only God. His fingerprints were all over this. And it was his way of saying to me that I'm not going to reveal to you everything right here and now. You need to trust me. But again, listen to these words. The Lord himself goes before you and will be with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. And when I thought of that, when I thought of all these things, put it in that perspective, again, not knowing what the outcome would be, and it did, thankfully, lead to my wife and I getting married. We just celebrated our 8th anniversary a couple months back. And here we are. So it did work out the way I had hoped. But at the time, like I said, I had no way of knowing. But I did know that God was in it, and whatever the outcome may be, I was going to be in the center of his will. And if that meant doing so without my wife, if it meant doing so as with her as my friend, then God had something bigger and better in store for me. And in that, I could count on him. And the last part of that verse, do not be afraid, do not be discouraged, right? And that's verse 8 from Deuteronomy 31. And that was written on my heart. And it gave me peace. It calmed my heart. Didn't answer all my questions because I wanted the who, what, when, where, and how, and all that stuff. But what I did have was the assurance that God was with me. And he'd gone ahead of me. This was all in his plan. And he knit it all together perfectly in a way only God can. Or a very imaginative, romance novelist, I guess. But I just think it was powerful to me. And so all that to say this, if you are in a situation or you know somebody who's in a situation where they feel really unsure of their current circumstances and a whole lot of questions, a lot more questions than answers, feeling discouraged, feeling afraid, is look for God's fingerprints. Look for his signature on it, because he's doing something behind the scenes. And just give it to him. Seek him. Pray to him. And ask him. Even if you zigged when you're supposed to zag, I call God the great improviser. That even if we goof, now there may be some consequences. We may have to experience some bumps in the road. And even though things worked out the way I wanted them to, it didn't happen immediately. It took years. And there were bumps. There were definite challenges. It was not simple. It was not easy. It was not a Hallmark movie. But it worked out exactly and even better than I had hoped or dreamed. And I'm thankful for it. I'm better for it. And the same can be true for you. So just stick with it. Ask God to be in the middle of it. If he says, well, I really didn't want you to do this, but here we are, let's work through this. Or God said, trust me, I knew this was going to happen. I'm out way ahead of you, and I have plans for you. It may not look exactly the way you wanted it to. It'll be better. Or maybe it will turn out the way you think you want it, but it's going to be even better than you think you want it, if that made sense. So anyway, that's my encouragement to you today, and I hope you are encouraged by that. I would love it if you would take a moment and like and subscribe to the channel. It does help with these messages being, showing up in other people's searches. I encourage you to share it with somebody who may need this encouragement. Maybe it's a word for them. If it's a word for you, I'd love to hear from you and say, wow, I needed that, or here's where I am. Love to pray with you, or pray for you at least. Whatever the case may be, I do hope this message is encouraging to you. So with that, be encouraged, be an encourager. I look forward to talking to you again very soon. Take care.
Thank you for joining the Coach Barnabas podcast. We'd greatly appreciate your support by liking and subscribing to the podcast and setting up notifications so we can let you know when new episodes are available. We'd love to hear from you, so please leave a comment. Make a difference today.